Morning, everyone. Hello. Hopefully, we are streaming live and well. I am all in charge again this morning. Graham has abandoned me, and this is the first time I've had to go solo since we've changed the channel. So, hopefully, all the settings are working. You'll have to let me know if they are. But I thought what we'd discuss, we've had another new poll out, another MRP poll. Now, you may be thinking, oh, you get polls all the time, Phil. There's all these polls every day. It's ridiculous. There's actually hardly any polls out in this election. There are different types of poll. Most of them at this point are useless. Most of the polls that come out are what you would call voting intention polls. It's really weird. Like, you get them now and then between elections. There are some that do them regularly, like YouGov, because they're commissioned by newspapers like The Times. Other ones every now and then. And now we're getting absolutely rammed with voting intention polls. And yet, ironically, in the middle of a general election campaign, voting intention polls there's some interesting things in them, but they're mostly useless. Because what do we want? You say the sound. What is wrong with the sound? I can do nothing about the sound if you've got a problem with it. What we want to know is what's the result of the election, and what do we mean by the result of the election? How many seats are each party going to win? Voting intention polls, do you know what? Despite the fact that people keep going, oh, this voting intention poll says they're going to win this many seats, it doesn't tell you that. Can't tell you that. It's impossible. The only way we've ever sort of seen voting in, like we have, yes, and even I've done it, in the between elections, you put your voting intention polls through a rough and ready simulator, but it only works, it models past voter behaviour. But if voters have a very different attitude to this election, the model falls down. And we've got a lot of things that are very different in this election. We've got a lot of tactical voting. How do we know there's a lot of tactical voting? Not only have we seen a lot of tactical voting in Westminster by-elections and the local elections over the last couple of years, but even in the polls, even in the voting intention polls, but particularly in the MRP polls, which are the most important for this, we have seen Labour losing votes to the Lib Dems in areas where the Lib Dems are best placed to win. We've seen the Lib Dems losing votes to Labour in areas where Labour are best placed to win. That is tactical voting. Because there's a lot of tactical voting for other parties as well. There are some seats where the tactical vote to get rid of the Tory would be the SNP or Plaid or the Greens. But the majority of anti-Tory tactical voting is Labour, and then in second place, the Lib Dems. But this latest MRP poll, it's from focal data, so it's not really one that's proven, if you like, except the fact that, the results were pretty much basically the same as Ipsos's from last week. And they said, and it's got exactly the same results as everyone else. And that is, I'm just going to put up a quick little thing here. So this is something I've done. I'm going to explain this. If the sound's too loud, there's nothing I can do about it, I'm afraid. The sound is absolutely whack-eye from my point of view. I'm afraid you'll have to adjust your own thing. There have been 4 people who've produced MRP polls in this election. Now, there are a few others, technically, that have used MRP methods. However, they've not been full MRP polls. They've been sort of like hybrid polls. And don't want to include those. I mean, even their results are very similar to these in terms of what I'm going to explain in a moment. But because they're not proven to me, I'm not going to muddy the waters. But in terms of MRP polls that have been released over the last week, we've had 3. We've had one from Focal Data, which was released yesterday, one from Ipsos last week, one from YouGov last week. And they're all saying the same thing. If you look at their headline results, the seat breakdown, how many seats are each of these parties going to get, it says the Conservatives are going to get their worst ever result. However, they are still going to be comfortably in second place. They're going to lead the opposition. However, if you start to say, okay, let's apply some filters here. Let's have a look what happens. How many seats are they going to win by a margin of more than 5% or 10%? Because they're not safe unless it's at least 10%. Because remember, you've got a 5% error on these anyway. Any mathematical model, any statistical model, realistically has an error of 5% anyway, even if you're confident in your model. If your model's a good model, you've got 5% error in the data. You can't really do much about that. And then consider the fact that things have just been getting worse. Things have been getting worse for the Tories, not from us, for the Tories, over the course of this election. It started off pretty badly with Rishi Sunak announcing the election in the pouring rain. And actually, it's gotten worse since then. That is not even the worst point for Rishi Sunak. You would have thought it'd all be uphill from there. No, not a bit of it. They managed to make it much worse. Some of the things got worse that were a bit out of their control. Some of them were very much in their control. And it's... but the what is coming out of this MRP poll, which is exactly the same as came out of the Ipsos poll, the YouGov poll, also the Survation MRP poll, but that's now quite old. I mean, all of these are technically old because by the time they published them, there's another week's gone by because it takes time to analyse the data, right? But what it's saying is, although the Tories are on for winning more seats than the Lib Dems have more safe seats than the Tories. So you've got lots and lots of seats that have been won by really small margins. So there's a question there about the Green Party. So just as a technical thing. So in terms of MRP polls, remember, all polls have their problems. You could argue there are like, I suppose at the moment there's like 4 types of polls out at the moment. You've got voting intention polls. All the best they can do is tell you what is the likely spread of votes across the country. In other words, what percentage of people are going to vote for each party. That's all they can tell you. That's it. If you try and get any other information out of it, I mean, obviously it can be broken down by demographic. We can use voting intention polls to show, oh, hardly any young people are going to vote for the Conservatives, things like that. But that's all it is. It doesn't tell you really. And there's a regional aspect. So we can see from voting intention polls that most people in, say, the north of England are fairly settled on how they're going to vote. Most of the uncertainty is in the south of England and Scotland. But from the point of view of getting the Tories into third place, the important area there is the south of England. There's MRP polls, which are the ones for looking at seats breakdown, but they have their problems as well because they cannot take account of local issues. So if you've got a particularly prominent local candidate or just, you know, I meant to say independent candidate, sorry. So like Islington North with Jeremy Corbyn, MRP poll can't really tell you anything about that. Southwest Norfolk, is it Liz Truss's seat in Norfolk where you've got James Bagg? Again, it can't really tell you much about that. The other thing an MRP poll will struggle with is, and addresses your thing about the Green Party, smaller parties. So because on the micro level, certain assumptions will change things quite a lot. For example, I'm not going to name any names here because I'm a Labour Party member, but there's a particular seat in the country where the tactical vote is for the Lib Dems, and 3 of the MRP polls say the Lib Dems are ahead, but one of them says Labour are ahead. Now, they're all using MRP, right? So you think, well, how can you get such a difference there? And it is a big difference, by the way. It's not just marginal. It is a big difference. You think, well, how can you end up with such a difference? It's because of the assumptions you make. All mathematical models have to have certain assumptions. So what happens is the way pollsters do these polls is they get their data. They have a methodology for even collecting the data, which can vary by pollster. And then they carry out their analysis. And then what they do is they look at the results and they say, not quite sure about that. And then they manually tweak to make it seem plausible. For example, Focal Data have actually said in their methodology, and this is perfectly reasonable, by the way. It sounds like it's not reasonable, but it is. They have said in their data, in fact, I'm going to read it out. Well, I'll not read the whole thing, actually, it's boring. But they have said if they were to just literally apply their mathematical model, the Tories, instead of coming out at like 110 seats, it comes out at like 60, and they think that's too low. So they've twisted a dial to sort of basically give the Tories a few extra seats, is literally what they've done. And pollsters do that to try and make it fit. So yeah, it's the Tories really are looking like they could well be in third. It's like it's almost there. I can't, if I could explain anything to anyone around the country in terms of what the polls are saying, and the mainstream media are not really explaining this, it's almost they could actually be beaten to. In theory, they could be beaten to fourth place. There's a huge level of uncertainty in Scotland. There's a lot of seats that are actually between the SNP and Labour, so it's not part of this Tories into third place thing. But there's a lot of seats that polls mostly are saying Labour are probably going to win. But again, that's small margins. There's really are. So you could end up with a situation where the Tories are in. Now, as a Labour member, my outcome is that they're in third place, because otherwise that means Labour losing a load of seats. But, from the point of view of strictly speaking, tactically voting the Tories out, there is a realistic, I don't just mean a mad outcome where you go, oh, well, let's just pretend 30% of people voted suddenly this different way. I mean, there is actually a realistic outcome where the Tories are in fourth place. But they could also be in second place. And they could also be in a comfortable second place. Josh, £2 super chat, thank you. It says, place your bets on what's the last Tory scandal. Well, they're running out of time for another one, aren't they? I mean, they've managed to make enough of a mess of this latest one. There's so many. Do you know what I found incredible? So James Cracknell, for those who don't know, he was an Olympic rower, and he's a Conservative candidate in this election. And he has now been very rude about his own party. He's described them in very unflattering terms. And do you know why? Because of this betting scandal. And I thought to myself, hang on, mate. He's talking as if this just came out in the election and it's a surprise to him. The Conservatives have been dogged by not only scandals, but covering up for the scandals, downplaying the scandals. Now, there's always a certain amount, of course, where you can get people in any political party, when a scandal rears its head, and all parties have had their scandals, no one's whiter than white, they've all had them. And there is a sense in which you go, okay, you try and protect the party image. So sometimes you end up trying to cover up as thinking, we don't want this reflecting badly on the party. But when it comes out, you have to act. If you want to try and cover it up, I would still say, that's not actually doing yourself any favours. But when it comes out, you don't then double down on covering it up. And yet that's what the Tories have been, and they've been doing it so often. Like, this betting scandal's just the latest one. Is this James Cracknell seriously trying to say, oh yeah, the Tories, I thought they were paragons of virtue until this? Is he off his head? Did he not pay attention to the Owen Paterson scandal? The Owen Paterson scandal is arguably the biggest Tory scandal of this last Parliament. Partygate hurt people more, but it was centred on a smaller section of the party. Most of the party didn't really know it was going on. It was centred around some people at it wasn't just Boris Johnson, it wasn't just Downing Street, it was also at CCHQ. But it was an isolated group of people at the top of the party. Most MPs probably didn't even know it was going on. In fact, I'm sure they didn't. So, arguably, although that was more damaging, the main problem the Tories did for themselves there is not taking robust action. They should have actually all come out against it instead of trying to cover for Johnson. But arguably the Owen Paterson scandal was the worst, because that was Tory MPs deliberately disbanding a committee which exists to make sure MPs follow certain standards. They actually voted to obliterate that committee to get one person who was as guilty as sin off. So there we go. The photo bombing by the Lib Dems at the Leander Club, well known to Cracknell. Yes, I suppose it would be. That's the other thing as well. For a rower, why would you, in the Parliament where the Tories have polluted so many rivers, badly polluted to the point where even a rower can become ill by rowing. They don't even have to go swimming in the lake, in the river. So why would someone with that background to choose. I can understand someone having conservative views. I can understand that he's right wing, that his politics is right wing. I get that. Why would you choose this election to stand for Parliament after what they've done? Why would you choose that? Because even if you are genuinely of right wing political leaning and you're like a conservative, this surely is not the election to go, yeah, I want to throw my lot in with this lot. Vision Thing, £10 super chat, thank you very much. If we can get enough seats, the Labour Party and the Co-op Party should split. No! And then the Co-op can be the official opposition to Labour. No. Although it has been joked at that there is an outcome whereby, yeah, a Labour splinter group could actually be the official opposition. But no, we don't want that. I'm quite happy with the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems, I mean, there's a bit of a streak of NIMBYism in the Lib Dems, which I don't approve of, but that's fine because, you know, there'll be some, let's be honest, the way things are going, there's going to be quite a bit of NIMBYism in Labour, but, you know, Starmer's determined to chop through that, so we shall see. The Lib Dems are going to ask perfectly sensible questions on things like international trade, EU relationships, water quality, food security, energy security. There are plenty of things where the Lib Dems can differ a great deal from Labour, and yet, because the thing I will always say about the difference between the Conservatives and Reform UK, basically the Tories, they're all Tories, the difference between them and other parties is other parties want what's best for people. We just disagree about what's best for people. But they all are motivated. All of the parties, there are individuals in those parties that are selfish, but all of the vast majority of political parties, even some we don't necessarily approve of, are motivated by what they believe is best for people. The Tories and Reform UK are not. I mean, I even include the DUP in that. The DUP are still motivated in what they think is best for people. The Tories and the Reform UK are consciously trying to hurt people. They consciously use people as commodities. They see people as commodities. They don't believe in society. Ivan Ambrose, 499 Super Chat, thank you. It says, it was a scandal, though, with all the Tories defending Johnson over Partygate. Yes, that indeed was it. But the original source of the scandal, which was Partygate itself, I mean, that is why Partygate was such a serious issue for the Tories, because they didn't go, hang on, this isn't right. And they should have done, but they didn't. So that was the scandal there. But the actual Partygate scandal was centred on a relatively small number of people at the top. It was still a lot of people, but it was, compared to the size of the party, relatively small. And most of the Conservative Party would have been just as appalled. Many MPs would have been just as appalled. Whereas the Owen Paterson scandal, they all went in eyes wide open. They all knew what they were doing. They all knew what they were doing. There was nothing hidden from them. Pulling £85 says, Phil, I got to use the line, I want my country back, against our own right-wing independent nutter, but clarified I wanted it from them lot. Yeah. Yeah, well, it is mad, isn't it? It would, you know, Nigel Farage was doing his little talk last night. Oh, I had 1,500 people. It was massive. It's like 1,500 people's note, mate. It was a sunny evening. Nigel Farage was offering to be the local entertainment. So, and I'm quite sure all those people there like Nigel Farage and are going to vote for him. Absolutely, sure. Apart from the people who have travelled in from outside. But he had 1,500 people turn up to listen to some entertainment of a sunny evening. They had seats laid out for them, all very pleasant, nice little field. I mean, that's no big deal. You know, someone pointed out that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, he had like over 100,000 people cheering his name at Glastonbury. Still lost the election. And those people, you know, those people went to Glastonbury. They didn't travel all that distance just to see Jeremy Corbyn. Some of them, I suppose, may have been. It's a hell of a hassle getting to Glastonbury. So most of those people were there for some other purpose. You know, so, I mean, like, Jeremy Corbyn's more popular than Nigel Farage, probably, in terms of his core support. He'd probably get more people turning out for him. But he still lost the election really badly. Because, you know, the vast... Because that's the thing about Marmite politicians. Like, Keir Starmer would never get a massive crowd turning out to listen to what he had to say. He's not a great orator. He's not got a fan base or anything like that. You know, he's not going to get a huge number of people. He'll get Labour supporters, right, if he's doing a Labour event, but he can't just put on an event like that and get loads of people turning up. But at the same time, the country want him to be Prime Minister. Whereas someone like Nigel Farage is like, he's got his core of support that are absolutely mad for him. Oh, they'll throw the knickers at him and everything. They love him. But it's a really small core of the country. Most of the country hate him. It's not like he's got this strong core of support and most of the country are ambivalent towards him. Oh, I'm not really sure about him. No, they are sure about him. They hate him. You know, if Nigel Farage actually did take over somehow the Conservative Party, it's really hard to see how he could like populism is very, you know, you cannot be complacent about it. But he's not the right person to do it. He's too toxic. Anyway, another £10 super chat, very generous. Thank you, Tinkanator. Did I hear Rory Stewart calling for a wealth tax? No, but he's a mad one, isn't he? Even One Nation Tories, investment managers, bankers and business leaders think it's needed to enable investment in the economy and public services. I'll tell you what I have noticed on wealth taxes, however. I haven't seen that specific one, but I'll tell you what I have noticed, because he's even said that he might even think about voting Green, which is a hell of a shift from an old Etonian. But then people kept saying things like, even Conservatives saying, how was he ever in the Conservatives? How was he ever in the Conservatives? And I'll tell you how he was ever in the Conservatives. Because he went to Eton. Like, when you go to a posh private school, or indeed any private school, there's a really high likelihood you end up as a Conservative, because that's just the environment you live in. You just think, you know, when we grow up, like, we all like to think of ourselves as independently thinking people, but there's lots of things that are in our heads that we think are universal truths that are not. We were just brought up to believe it. Like, a lot of our moral compass wasn't arrived at by ourselves. It was given to us by parents or other elders in our lives. Like, not murdering being bad. Yeah, don't murder's bad. Yeah, we all agree on that. But we all agree on it because we were all brought up to believe it. If you go back to ancient Greece, got a lisp, sorry, Greece, you know, you go back to the days of the Spartans, they didn't think it was a bad thing. In fact, Spartans, when they came of age, had to murder someone. It's part of their, like, right to adulthood. So, you know, lots of things that are part of us have been effectively indoctrinated into us. Did I see Farage is doing a thing in Rainton? £5 a ticket. Does any other party charge for attending rallies? No, but again, he's a grifter, isn't he? He's just a grifter. You can argue, I suppose, if you wanted to be generous about it, you could argue that for a political party that doesn't have much of a funding stream, they have to try and raise what they can, but they're just grifters. He's just in it for the money. He's in it. But there you go. They say Jez is loved, unlike Starmer, who is not. No, he's not. In case you hadn't noticed, he got absolutely battered in the last election because he was hated. He's loved by his cultists. But he's loved by more cultists probably than Farage. Oh, sorry, I was going about the wealth taxes. Yes. So, so, because I was just to explain, so how Rory Stewart ever became a Conservative when he's now saying he might vote Green, which is like completely the other side. And it's just because he's maybe started to reevaluate some of the things that were just ingrained in him as he was growing up. But wealth taxes, I'll tell you what I have noticed about wealth taxes as it's been discussed. So, I don't know how many of you think this. When someone says to me wealth tax, what that means to me is that you tax, well, wealth. You tax something that people already have, that they were given a long time ago or in the past. That's what a wealth tax is to me. And Labour have ruled that out. Although I don't know if they've ruled it out this election, but they have ruled it. So the default position is they have ruled it out. They haven't ruled it out in the manifesto, and I don't know if they've talked about it in this election campaign. But the last thing they ever said about wealth tax is they ruled it out. However, I'll tell you what is interesting, is there are some I've seen in the media things like inheritance tax and capital gains tax being described as wealth taxes. Now, so from this point of view, in terms of where we go with wealth taxes, it all depends on what you consider a wealth tax. Capital gains tax and inheritance tax, I'm not sure I can see it for inheritance tax a little bit, but we already have inheritance tax, so we already have a wealth tax in that sense. Labour have one policy on inheritance tax, which is to close off offshore trusts as a way of getting out of it. So they're blocking off a tax break for people paying inheritance tax. They may also, I know there are people like Dan Needle have actually argued you could actually raise the threshold of inheritance tax and yet still bring in more in inheritance tax. So if Labour really wanted to catch the Tories out on inheritance tax, they could just change the way it works. They could change it so that you raise the threshold, thereby they can say fewer people will be paying it, but take away they're already planning on taking away one big tax break on it, and you could still end up raising more money from it. So I wonder if Labour plan on that. But the other thing is capital gains tax. I'm not sure I see, you have to squint your eyes a lot, don't you, to see that as a wealth tax. But I do think there's a very high likelihood that Labour are going to be bringing capital gains tax at least more in line, if not completely in line with income tax. As soon as you bring it completely in line with income tax, because one of my major beefs with capital gains tax, I can see the sense in it, don't get me wrong, but if you've got a situation where someone chooses whether some income is capital gains or just income, and they choose the tax that's got the lowest rate, you're talking about someone choosing to fill in a tax return in order to lower their tax obligations. Well, that I'm not in favour of any form of tax avoidance. I know you can't stop all of that, but you should stop as much as you can. So making capital gains the same as income tax stops people doing that. It means that people will only fill in tax returns for capital gains if it's genuinely capital gains, because otherwise what's the point? You might as well just call it income. But because Labour what Labour have said is none of our plans require an increase in capital gains tax, which economists are happy to say, yeah, that's true. All their plans are costed. They do work out. However, Labour have also said they're going to do more than they're promising. So, you can read between the lines as much as you like. They haven't ruled out increasing capital gains tax. They're only saying they don't need to deliver their promises, but they're also saying they're going to deliver more than they're promising. So I think capital gains tax is going to be one that's going to be increased, because otherwise they'd just rule it out, wouldn't they? Beige Master there saying, I think the land value tax would be a far easier one to sell to the electorate. So much of the UK owned by a select few families' aristocracy. Some can be tricky though, because where you can fall into a little bit of a political trap, and I always cite inheritance tax as this, you can end up in a situation where you think, well, because only so many people would pay this tax, it's actually not going to piss off most people and therefore it's safe. However, there's that perception problem. Like 4% of people will pay inheritance tax, but about a third of people think they will. And that's a huge difference. So you've got literally about 1 in 3 people, according to polling last year from 2023, when it all became big news, YouGov found about 1 in 3 people think they're going to pay inheritance tax, but only about 4% do. And that is why you have to be a little bit careful. It's not just a case. Don't assume that people understand taxation. There's probably no actual tax experts here. I'm certainly not one. I have to refer to people like Dan Needle, whose most interesting thing, actually, particularly for our Scottish viewers, might be that unfortunately the Scottish government appear to be accidentally introducing something that's going to allow a massive level of tax avoidance. So actually, Labour are coming in trying to stamp out on tax avoidance, and unfortunately, the Scottish government are putting something in place. It's not for this purpose, it's not corrupt, but it's going to have the impact of allowing a massive number of tax avoidance schemes. And what Dan Needle has said is, because this is actually going to have a domino effect across the whole of the UK, really, you know how the Conservatives put the kibosh on the sort of gender recognition bill, which, you know, as it turned out, it wasn't within the Scottish Government's competency. Okay, whatever. But instead of doing that, they should have paid more attention to another bill that the Scottish Government have been putting through, which is going to create a load of tax avoidance schemes. Maybe the Tories actually knew about it and didn't care. But, you know, it seems to be inadvertent, but there's nothing to be done about it now. Starmer can't stop it. It's done. Finished. Too late. So you have to now basically hope that the Scottish Government realise and try and change some things. Joe, they're saying the issue with capital gains tax is the rate you can charge is essentially capped for investors of a certain size, as you could just make a corporation, then pay corporation tax instead. So, yeah, another issue with the tax system is you do have a lot of weird, like, breaks in it, rather than it being smooth. Because that's another thing. Taxation is complicated, to be fair. I mean, Gillian Keegan was going when she was trying to defend the fact that taxes are going to go up under the Tories. Oh, tax is complicated. Well, it is complicated, yes. Part of the reason it's complicated is because very wealthy people make it complicated. But there is a particular problem because taxation isn't very smooth. Yes, you can get to situations very genuinely where investment is effectively capped because of instead of a smooth transition, a jump. And it's not an easy thing to put the smooth transition in there. Again, according to experts, I'm not going to wax lyrical on it myself. But there we go. Oh, we've got a little Brexit question to finish off here because we have run out of time, I'm afraid. Starmer should remember that no one voted to leave the single market, not on the ballot. Leaving the single market wasn't a consequence of Brexit. It was a separate decision, and so on. True and not true. Well, first of all, I would say, I mean, Starmer is fully aware of exactly what the Brexit situation is and what people's attitude to it is. Unfortunately, we cannot say that no one voted to leave the single market because they did. A majority didn't vote to leave the single market, but there are two ways to get a public mandate for something in terms of the UK Constitution. The first is a referendum. That is not the route we like to go down. The fact that we've had quite a lot of referenda in the last 15 years, well, I say a lot, we've had a few, is weird. We generally don't have them in this country for good reason. They're really bad ideas. I mean, you could say with Switzerland, I would say they're a bad idea to have as many as they have in Switzerland, but at least they take account of the fact they have a lot of them and they have proper systems in place. We don't. The main way you get a public mandate for something in this country is by putting it in a manifesto and winning an election. And the Conservatives promised to leave the single market in the 2019 manifesto, and therefore it was deemed to have a public mandate. That is why you need to be so careful, because even if you look at something in a manifesto and go, well, that's not what's really bringing the votes in. The reason a manifesto exists for three reasons. Like if you take Labour's manifesto, because that is going to be the one that's deemed to have a public mandate after next week. There are three types of policy in Labour's manifesto. The first type of policy are the ones that are going to bring in the votes. It's the stuff they're putting in to say, we're promising to do this or we're ruling this out as a way of winning your vote. The second type of policy is what they're putting in order to be able to get it through the House of Lords easily, because they need to be able to say, you can't vote against this because we've got a public mandate. And then the third type of thing for the manifesto is things in there for the analyst to go, yes, this all works out. In other words, it all adds up. It all makes sense. It's all deliverable. So it's three things. One is for your voters. One type of thing in the manifesto is for your voters. One is for Parliament, so that Parliament doesn't go, no, you can't do that. And the third type is for analysts who want to be able to say, yes, this is sort of a plan. Or not, in the case. You say, Howard, the question was as clear as mud. Leave or remain the EU. No mention of single market. Not in the referendum, no. But in the general election. Remember, we don't do referenda in this country. Like, we've shown why we don't do it. It's a really bad idea. Obviously, something... Like, the only referendum we've actually had that was sensible was the Scottish referendum 2014, because obviously that has to be a referendum. Anything else? If you don't need a referendum to do it, then we really shouldn't do it. Or if we do, we should really put things in place. But there we go. George Shaw, £2 super chat. Thank you. Says leaving the single market was never a Brexit policy. It was the day we left, though, wasn't it? It wasn't during the election campaign, the Brexit referendum campaign. In fact, all the ones saying we should leave said we should stay. But in 2019, it was. In 2019, it was, and people voted for it. And, you know, that's unfortunately it. And it really doesn't matter whether they did or they didn't, because there's no way of joining it. Like, there is no way of joining the single market right now. There are 3 legal ways to join, and none of them are politically possible. One is you join the EU. We don't qualify, because the issue has to be politically settled. You're not even allowed to apply to join the EU until it's clear that your country, under any change of government, supports joining the EU. We don't have that. The second is to join EFTA. No one really wants to join EFTA. EFTA doesn't really want us to join EFTA. The third is to get a bespoke deal, which is just for us, which requires the agreement of like all of the EU members and all of the EFTA members, because they get a say in it, as well as the UK. That's it. So there's no way to join the single market. People just say it as if you can pull a lever. No, you can't. But there we go. But we'll have to leave it there. We're sort of run out of time, I'm afraid. I've got loads of work to do today as well, and it's very hot. But, I mean, the main thing I would say, just coming back to the first point, you know, if we can get rid of the Tories into 3rd or even 4th place, but 3rd place is fine. If we get them into 3rd place, that creates a much bigger groundswell of opinion towards electoral reform as well. Because think about it this way. There's already people go, oh, Labour, if they win this big majority, won't want it. Labour are not that stupid. They know that it's not going to last. There's now a lot of support for electoral reform in Labour. There's obvious support in the Lib Dems. There's support in the Greens, even though they're not really getting behind it very strongly, but I suspect they will. There's support even in Reform UK. And after this election, if you beat the Tories right down, there could be support in the Conservative Party. The Conservatives may actually like to separate themselves off from their loony brethren. You know, you could get... Because think about it this way. There's a lot of right-wing voters who are moderate right-wing voters. They don't like Nigel Farage. They don't like Reform UK. They don't want to be in the Lib Dems either. They don't want to be in Labour. They want a party that is like their party of Thatcher, right? Their party of John Major, maybe. They don't want what the Tory party are about to become. So I think, you know, there could be a lot of support for proportional representation. And you know, this big push could really give it. Last one there, then. Noam Degu, $5 super chat. Thank you. As an American, it still baffles me that Brexit was able to be voted in by a simple majority of the content. Because ultimately, the Brexit vote was nothing to do with leaving the EU. It was all about keeping the Conservative Party together. It was a weak leader, David Cameron, a weak leader trying to stop his party from splitting. That's all it was for. You know, these are people who have no regard for the country. It's only difficult to understand if you assume that despite political differences, most politicians have some regard for their country. They don't. David Cameron never did. But anyway, on that happy thought, we'll have to leave it there. We've gone well over. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of day. If you like it sunny, good luck. And until next time, I'll see you later.